Welcome to the real Mr.Beer, Mr. Beer's own channel. We're here to provide you with homebrewing guidance and tips, equipping you with all sorts of beer knowledge. My name is Tim Falk. I'm the customer service manager here at Mr. Beer. If you've ever called or emailed us, you've probably spoken with me. Today we're going to be brewing our Rapturous Raspberry recipe and talking a bit about fruit beers as a style and also how to brew fruit beers with your Mr. Beer kit. The Rapturous Raspberry has a 4.8 star review on our website, so it's pretty popular. We'll go over the vital statistics real quick like always. It has an ABV of 4.4%. ABV stands for alcohol by volume. It tells you how much alcohol is in your beer. It has an SRM of 6. SRM, of course, is the system that brewers use to measure the color of their beer. It stands for Standard Reference Method, and it's on a scale of 1 to 40. So 6 out of 40 isn't terribly dark. It's certainly on the pale side. It's got 13 IBUs. IBU stands for International Bitterness Units. It's a way brewers measure how bitter their beer is. It's on a scale of 1 to 100, so 13 is definitely on the malty side. This is a great beer for fans of Dark Horse Brewing's Raspberry Ale or Founders Brewing Rubaeus Ale. Hi, Ed D.S. Thole Jr. Our standard Rapturous Raspberry recipe includes a can of Aztec Mexican Cerveza and a smooth LME, both of which I already have soaking in hot water. The reason for that is the stuff in those containers is real thick like molasses, and we want to make sure we get as much of that stuff out of the can and packet as we can, for reasons I'll go over later. So we soak it in hot water to loosen it up a bit and make that a little easier. This recipe also calls for a packet of Safale SO4 yeast. This is an English ale yeast, so you could use it with stouts, porters, English brown ales, ESB, stuff like that. Today we're using it for a fruit beer though. As we're going to come to see, fruit beers are a very versatile style. It's almost kind of weird to even call it a style, but we'll go over that later. You're also going to get your no-rinse cleanser, like always. And you're going to get 2 cans of these red raspberries. Now, we're going to go over how you add the raspberries here in a minute, but I'd like to say before we get too far that this is a pretty old recipe. It was written a pretty long time ago, and we change our recommendations over time to improve our processes. As we get customer feedback and as we brew our own recipes, we figure out better ways of doing things. So when you consult the Rapturous Raspberry instructions on our website, it's going to tell you to do some stuff that's a little bit different than what I'm going to tell you to do. I'm going to refer you to our great blog about how to brew fruit beers. It has all the tips that I'm going to mention today. But more on that later. So that's what all the kit includes. Now, when you're picking what kind of fruit to use in your fruit beer, there are a couple things to consider. A common question is, what variety of fruit should I use? Frozen versus canned versus fresh. We typically recommend canned fruit because fresh fruit tends to have a lot of wild yeast and bacteria on them, just occurring naturally. Like I always say, it's nothing that's going to make anybody sick, but it can cause off flavors in your beer. So if you were going to use fresh fruit, you would have to pasteurize it, which typically means just steeping it in not boiling, but boiled water for about half an hour. If you want to get real fancy, you can go online and find some charts that'll tell you what temperature to have the water at and how long to have it at that temperature to pasteurize something. So at any rate, for the sanitation reason, canned fruit is typically preferable. It's also much easier to puree, which kind of gives you a bit more juice and flavor. What kind of fruit to use? Really the sky is the limit. If you can find it, you can probably find a way to add it to your beer. As we're going to go over later, you're going to want the kind of fruit you use to complement the base beer you're using. So if you want to make a beer with blueberries in it, that might taste kind of weird with a porter, to some brewers, or that might taste great to some brewers. So just kind of mentally match, the flavor you're going for with the style that you're using. How much fruit you're going to use is kind of going to depend on what you want your beer to be like and what kind of fruit you're using. Obviously some fruits have a more mild flavor, like blueberries and strawberries, and some fruits have a more distinct, powerful flavor, like mangoes or boysenberries have a pretty strong, distinct flavor. So if you're using a strongly flavored fruit, you'd want to entertain the idea of using a little less. Also, if the style of beer you're making it with has a really strong flavor, like say you're making a fruit beer out of a real strong IPA, you're going to want to keep in mind that your fruit could get kind of drowned out by your hop flavor. So you might want to consider adding more or less depending on what kind of style you're using. Another consideration is that the sweeter the fruit is, typically the less you will want to add. So if you were using sweet cherries, for example, you'd want to use 1 can as opposed to 2. One real easy thing you can do is just go to our website and look at a beer that uses the kind of fruit you're going to use. Like if you're going to make a beer with blueberries in it, look at our Blue Patriot recipe. If you want to use raspberries, look at this Rapturous Raspberry recipe. See how much they use there. Or you can always feel free to shoot us an email or call us, and myself, Josh, or our new customer service rep Tyson will be happy to help you out, and I'll let you know how much you could use in this case. The smooth LME that's included with this recipe is going to add ABV, so it's going to give the beer more alcohol. It's going to alter the flavor a little bit. The Mexican Cerveza is a light beer. The smooth LME is a bit darker than the Aztec Mexican Cerveza. So this is an instant where adding the LME is actually going to change the flavor of our finished product. As you guys might already know, smooth is our amber LME, or liquid malt extract, and it'll add kind of toffee or caramel notes to the beer in addition to that ABV in the body. So, usually you're going to start by sanitizing. However, in this case, for this particular recipe, you're going to go ahead and puree 1 of your cans of raspberries in a sanitized blender. Here we use an immersion blender and just a plastic pitcher. But if you have just a regular old blender, one of those little magic bullet ones, those are just fine too. You're just going to want to sanitize it. You can use kind of just a pinch of no rinse sanitizer and then fill it up with however much water your vessel holds. You can use something like Star San. You can sanitize first if you really want to. But I always like to show you guys how to sanitize just so we can all be on the same page how it goes. So at any rate, we switched things up a little this time and we pureed our raspberries first. You'll notice I said to puree 1 can. If you look on our website at the Rapturous Raspberry instructions that maybe Matt can throw up in the chat for us, you'll note that the original brewer who wrote the recipe wants you to add both cans of raspberry at the initial fermentation right before you pitch your yeast, or shortly after flame out, which is when we take our water off the boil. However, as we mentioned in our blog, we found that we actually get some better results if we have a late fruit addition, kind of like you would have a late dry hopping addition. If you add 1 of your cans of raspberry a week before you bottle, it's going to leave you with a bit more raspberry flavor and aroma, which is obviously something we're going for here. The yeast have a tendency to kind of strip out some of that, and of course it settles out in the rest of the sediment, the seeds and the pulp and all that good stuff. So long story short, a late fruit addition gives you more flavor. So if I'm doing a fruit beer that has 2 cans of fruit, I'm going to do 1 at the beginning and 1 a week before I bottle. If I'm doing a recipe that just has 1 can of fruit, I'm going to go ahead and add that whole can of fruit just the week before I bottle. You're going to want to keep in mind that just like adding any other sugar to beer, adding fruit to your beer is not going to make it sweeter. However, sugar is not the only thing that gives a raspberry its raspberry taste. So everything else that tastes and smells like raspberry is going to stay in our beer. That sugar is just going to get fermented into alcohol and carbon dioxide like all the other sugar in any other beer. Kaiju Brew is saying when he bottles fruit beer, he gets fruit bits stuck in the bottling wand. Any tips? Couple tips. So first, Kaiju, I would ask if you're cold crashing, which, as you guys may be aware, refers to putting your fermenter in the fridge for 24 to 48 hours right before you bottle. That typically makes all the sediment settle to the bottom and become compact. If you're already doing that and you're still getting bits of fruit in your bottles, I would entertain the idea of propping up the spigot end of the fermenter with a couple books or something like that, so it settles away from the spigot. So like he says, he is cold crashing. If you are cold crashing, like I said, I recommend propping up the spigot ends so that stuff settles away from the spigot. If you're doing all that and you're still getting bits of fruit when you bottle, my suggestion would be to either use a hop sack next time, or what I've been doing lately is we have these little strainers here. They're pretty easy to come by, little kitchen strainers. So if you just sanitize these and pour your pureed fruit through one of them, I find that kind of strains out a lot of the seeds and pulp that end up as sediment, but still leaves you all the juice and the sugars that you're going to want for your flavor, aroma, and your ABV. So there are a couple things you can do. Like I said, you can also use a hop sack. So now that we've kind of covered that, fruit beers are going to tend to produce a lot of sediment compared to other beers of similar style. So when brewing a fruit beer, you're definitely going to want a cold crash. I do it every single time because it's a real easy way to clarify the beer and just kind of cleans up the bottles a little bit. If you don't cold crash, you're going to want to start when you do this recipe. So to sanitize, we are going to go ahead and assemble our fermenter. We're going to go ahead and take the nut and hold it inside. I put in the spigot at about a 90-degree angle and then tighten down the nut. And then I turn it the rest of the way, holding it by the spigot. The reason being that the spigot is easier to get a hold of than the nuts. So it just makes it easier to make sure it's good and tight. And then we're going to fill this up with a gallon of water. This water doesn't have to be any special kind of water. You can just use tap water. It's going to get dumped out anyway. We're going to fill our fermenter up to the number 1 line, or if you have an older fermenter, it might say the 4-quart line instead. The number 1 line is about 4 quarts, in case you were wondering. Like I was mentioning earlier, the reason we sanitize is because beer is a very attractive environment for bacteria, mold, and wild yeast. Now, none of those are going to make anybody sick. If you get an infected batch, the worst thing that's going to happen is it might not taste very good. Which isn't the end of the world, but then you have to call us and talk to us and get a replacement mailed to you, and you have to listen to our lecture about what went wrong. It's better to just take care of it the first time around. So to avoid infection, everything that's going to touch the beer has to be sanitized with our no-rinse cleanser. So you're going to pour half this packet into your 1 gallon of water. You're going to save the other half for bottling day, because on bottling day, all those surfaces are going to need to be sanitized as well. So once you've got your half a packet of cleanser in there, you're going to go ahead and twist on your lid, and you're going to give it a good shake. You're going to notice some water dripping out around the lid. That's perfectly normal. The lid is not airtight because, like I mentioned, fermentation produces carbon dioxide, which needs to escape as fermentation goes on, or your fermenter will rupture. Then we're going to pour our sanitizing solution into a little tub so we can sanitize our utensils. For utensils, I just use a spatula. We like to use one with a flat edge like this because it makes it easier to scrape out the can. So that makes it a little bit easier. I also got a whisk for aerating my wort. I got my scissors for opening my LME. And I also got a can opener for my HME. Kaiju, I always put my hops in naked. I've been reconsidering that when I'm using something like 2 or 3 ounces of hops in a 2-gallon batch, which is pretty uncommon. But just for a typical beer, I won't bother because I have been happy with the results I get with cold crashing. I don't really find hop sacks to be necessary. Okay, so Now that we have sanitized our equipment and simultaneously checked our fermenter for leaks, we're going to take 4 cups of filtered water and we're going to bring it to a boil. The reason we use filtered water is that it has a higher quality than tap water, but it still has the minerals in it that yeast need to stay alive. If you use like distilled water or reverse osmosis water, that's not really going to work very well. Or rather, at least it's not going to be optimal for your yeast. SO4 is a pretty hardy yeast. I can't think of a single batch where I pitched SO4 and I had any kind of yeast related problems or off flavors. It's a very forgiving yeast. Like I said, it's very common to find in any English ale. Okay. So this is the longest part of the entire brewing process, is waiting for your water to boil. Although I will say that if we were brewing the old-fashioned way from scratch with an all-grain kit, this would be a much, much longer process. It would take about 3 to maybe 6 hours, depending on what you're doing. You'd need to do a mash and a hot boil, which are both pretty time-consuming. You would probably need to do it outside because your ovens and burners probably wouldn't be hot enough to heat up all the water that you need. So it's a much more involved process. There's a lot more room for error. I'm certainly not trying to trash all grain brewing. Obviously, it's a great way to make beer because it's how beer is made. It's just that it is a bit more complicated. So for us beginner intermediate types, these all extract kits are a great option to brew if you don't have all that space, all that time, all that money for the initial investment into equipment. So we're waiting for our water to boil. Remember, you're not going to want to boil your fruit ever. The reason is that this makes the fruit release pectin, which can make the beer be hazy. As we're going to find out when we talk about fruit beers as a BJCP style, haze is typically going to be considered undesirable in our fruit beers. So cold crashing should help with that. Irish moss could help with that. But not boiling your fruit kind of just avoids the whole pectin issue altogether. Waiting for our water. The other nice thing about dry hopping naked is that you don't have to bother sanitizing your hop sack, like boiling it. You can just kind of dump the hops in. That saves you a little step, saves you a little equipment. So once we mix our extracts with the water, it's going to be called wort. And then once the yeast eats up the sugar in the wort and turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide, you'll have flat beer. This water that I'm going to add into my fermenter is cold. It's been refrigerated, so it's about 36 degrees. The reason for that is when we pitch our yeast, we want our wort to be at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. If you pitch your yeast, which means adding your yeast to the fermenter, at a warmer temperature than that, you can develop off flavors caused by compounds like acetaldehyde, which is a compound that's kind of unique to pitching your yeast warm. It can also happen from infections or other temperature issues. But the point is, if you pitch your yeast too warm, you're likely to get this green apple cidery kind of flavor. That's not pleasant. It doesn't mesh well with your beer, and it takes forever to condition out. If it does condition out. So you're going to want to watch your temperatures real quickly. Like I've said before, brew day is where you stop your problems before they start. If you make a mistake on brew day or something happens on brew day, you're not going to know for 6 weeks or more, and then you're going to drink your beer and it's going to be a bummer. So, you're going to want to lay out and check all your equipment first. We're always in here 15 minutes before the show starts, making sure everything's in order. So you're going to want to do that. You're going to want to read your recipe all the way through, make sure you understand the instructions, and if you got any questions about those instructions, make sure you let us know right away. We're happy to get you squared away with that. As a reminder, you're also not going to want to boil the canned hopped malt extract. It's because the hop boil is already done for that product, which means if you boil it any further, it can develop a grassy off flavor. The liquid malt extract and the dry malt extract and the soft pack, however, can be boiled as much as you like, and in fact, you need to add some of that stuff if you want to do a hot boil. Kaiju also wants to know if you're using a temp-controlled fridge, whether you should let your beer cool down before you put it in that fridge. I don't bother. That sounds like one of those questions where every brewer is going to have a different answer and they're all going to be super insistent on why they do it their way. I've just never really seen a need to. And obviously, the sooner you get it in the fridge, the sooner it gets down to the temperature you want. So that's also a plus. I just don't really see any reason to wait. If you have the fridge set up, why bother? So we don't boil the HME, but we can boil the LME or the DME. We don't boil the fruit because the fruit is gonna give off a pectin haze if we boil it. If we're only adding 1 can of fruit per our blog, I highly suggest adding it a week before you bottle rather than now. But since we have 2 cans of fruit, one of them is going to go in now. Like Josh is pointing out, stone fruit like peaches and apricots will benefit from the addition of pectinase, pectic enzyme, which is a natural chemical that breaks down pectin. Pectin, again, is that chemical or compound rather in fruit that can give it the haze if boiled. Or some fruit just have a lot of pectin, like stone fruit in Josh's example. I was kicking around the idea of maybe doing a dragon fruit wine, which is looking like it's going to be crazy expensive to do 100% dragon fruit. But at any rate, there's another fruit that's real pectin-y that you're going to need some pectinase to break down. I just dropped my wedding ring. It could have been all bad. Nobody told my wife, all right? Looks like our water is good and boiling. So we're going to go ahead and turn that off. Again, we don't want to actually boil our extract or our fruit. Thank you, Matt. We're going to go ahead and open our can of extracts. Like Josh points out, pectinase is quite easy to find at any homebrew supply store. I'm sure they have it on places like Amazon. Any number of retailers are going to carry that. Okay, so we're pouring in our malt extracts. We're using our flat-edged spatula to go ahead and scrape out that can really well, because the more extract that you leave behind, the more flavor, aroma, color, body, and alcohol you're going to lose. So if you don't clean this can out real well, you're not going to be getting the most out of your beer. So we want you to get your money's worth. We want you to make good beer. So make sure you scrape the can good and clean. Same goes for this pouch of liquid malt extract I'm going to add here in a minute. Yep, Josh points out prickly pear and dragon fruit are both mucilaginous, meaning they're going to need some pectinase. Josh, you still have to show me that prickly pear wine recipe. But prickly pear fruit is like such a pain to track down. Our new guy Tyson says he thinks he might be able to find it at a farmer's market, so maybe we'll be able to play with that this fall. Alright, I think that's good enough. Some of you are probably clutching your pearls at the sacrilege of how much malt I just threw away, but you know, you guys are busy people, you have stuff to do, I don't want to keep you too long. Now we're gonna cut open our liquid malt extract. You know, I'm just gonna put this batch back in here. We're gonna go ahead and squeeze that out. As you can see, the smooth, aka amber malt extract is a bit darker than our Aztec Mexican Cerveza. It's going to be adding those toffee kind of caramel sort of notes you'll find in an amber ale. You could drip some hot water to help scavenge the remaining extract. That's a good point. I didn't want to make you guys sit and watch me do that, but you're absolutely correct. You could definitely rinse it out with a little bit of hot water and go ahead and throw it in there. Just make sure it's not too much. But yeah, just a little splash of water is just fine. And then I'm gonna go ahead and, like usual, give it another little stir. Since that extract is so heavy, it tends to settle out to the bottom. Now I'm gonna fill up my fermenter halfway to the number 1 or 4-quart line with cold water. Again, I use cold because I want my wort to be at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit when I pitch my yeast, which just means adding it to the fermenter. Just keeping it stirring, like I said, so I don't get too much stuck to the bottom, which can happen. Alrighty, so got it filled up to the number 1 line with our cold water. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our hot mix of extract and water. If you have a funnel, I recommend using it. Makes this whole process much neater. I'm gonna go ahead and scrape out my pan a little bit here so we don't waste any. Now when I fill it up to the number 2 line, I'm actually going to stop just short of the number 2/8.5 quart line because we're going to go ahead and add in our 1 pound of pureed canned raspberries. Man, this is really dark fermenter. You'll notice when you get our products that have the brown tint to keep out the UV light like we've discussed. Some of them are darker than others and some are lighter. It won't affect your beer any, but can make it see. Hard to see through it. And then we add in our pureed raspberry.
You can move everything over.
I can move everything over, that's a good point. Okay, so I've added my pureed raspberry into my fermenter. The water I just boiled all got mixed in with oh, you mean, well, I mean, it could work. Is your can pretty clean after you used mixing the boiled water with the extract? I would think it would make it kind of stickier maybe. But at any rate, now we're going to go ahead and use our whisk to aerate our wort. We do that because yeast need oxygen just like we do, so we're going to get a little bit going in here. We're going to be careful not to scrape the sides of our fermenter because it is plastic, and if you scratch it, it can harbor bacteria, wild yeast, and mold. As I've mentioned before, the fermenters are amber colored because UV light, like from the sun, is actually what skunks beer, not heat, contrary to popular belief. So having beer in brown bottles and fermenters helps reduce the risk of off flavors caused by light strike. Okay, now we're gonna Okay, so now we're gonna pitch our yeast. Like I said, Kaiju, I usually don't bother letting it sit. Instead, I use cold refrigerated water to mix in my hot extract with. You know, when I started doing that, I measured it I measured the temperature every time. And I stopped bothering because it always came out to exactly 65 Fahrenheit. When you mix water that's about 36 degrees with the just boiled water and the extract. So I hear a lot of our brewers asking about chilling their wort. Do they need an immersion chiller? Do they need an ice bath? I never do. And I've never had off flavors from high temperatures from pitching my yeast. due to that warm temperature. The 2G tall fermenter is clear now brown. Yeah, those aren't quite clear. I mean, you'll see clear fermenters. They're quite common. Carboys. I guess buckets aren't clear. I guess it's really just carboys. But at any rate, carboys are clear, and they're very common fermenters, brewing vessels. And, just keep it out of sunlight, and it's not a problem. Light bulbs aren't an issue because they don't have UV light. Okay, so we've closed our fermenter. We're not going to open it again until we have to add our second can of pureed raspberries. We're only going to open the lid long enough to add our ingredients. If you keep opening up the lid just to look at it and peek, because wow, this looks so cool and I want to see where my foam's at, you're going to introduce those bacteria, wild yeast, and mold into your beer and get those off flavors that we're trying to avoid. So I highly recommend keeping your lid on as much as possible unless you absolutely have to take it off, like to add in ingredients. We recommend leaving all our beers in the fermenter for 3 full weeks. Now, that might seem kind of long compared to some other recommendations you might hear. While it's true that primary fermentation might technically be done in as little as 7 to 10 days, we find that giving the extra time reduces your odds of off flavors and saves you a little bit of conditioning time. It's not a terribly different notion from racking it to a secondary, except we just don't rack it. Because leaving it on the trub for as little as 3 or 4 weeks just isn't going to cause off flavors in our experience. You're going to want to ferment this beer and any beer that has SO4 yeast between 59 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Bear in mind that refers to the temperature of your wort, not the temperature of the air of the room it's in. Fermentation produces a little bit of heat. So if the room is 65 degrees, the beer might be 68. If the room is 72, the beer might be 75. And the difference between 72 and 75 might be the difference between having off flavors and not. So if you're unsure, give us a call. There are lots of easy ways to keep the temperature of your beer low. We'll be happy to go over those with you. After 24 hours, you'll start seeing activity, usually in the form of foam. I would note that with fruit beers, you're typically going to see a whole lot of foam because they have so much simple sugars in them. It's not terribly uncommon even to have your keg overflow with foam completely. This does not represent a problem. Just leave it alone. Let brewing continue. Just wipe it away from the outside so you don't get a mold going, and you should be just fine. But like I always like to point out, a much better indication that fermentation is happening is the sediment forming at the bottom of your fermenter, which is called trub. That stuff is made of spent yeasts and malt particles. It's just like I said, a byproduct of fermentation. If you see that sediment forming at the bottom of your fermenter, that means your beer is brewing. You can see it in this batch of cider, actually, although in cider and wine, it's called lees, not trub. But anyway, that's what we're looking for. It'll look pretty much the same whether you're doing beer, wine, mead. So that about covers it. Like I said, we're going to add our second can of raspberries a week before I bottle. I have not found it necessary to stir. If you were going to stir it in, you'd want to do so very gently with a sanitized instrument. We're trying to expose the beer to oxygen as little as possible. But like I said, I've simply never found it to be necessary. Every bottle has had plenty of fruit flavor without any kind of stirring or bothering the sediment or exposing it to oxygen. All right, now let's talk fruit beer. Fruit beer is category number 29 in the BJCP standards. Really, it's any beer with fruit in it, which we're using the culinary definition of fruit, which means fleshy seed-associated structures of plants that are sweet or sour. Fruit in this context does not refer to any spice, herb, or vegetable as defined in category 30. They specifically say if you have to explain how your ingredient constitutes a fruit, it probably doesn't count. The fruit character in any fruit beer should be evident but balanced. It shouldn't taste like fruit juice. It shouldn't taste sweet. It should taste like beer with fruit in it. All the usually identifiable components of the style, whatever the style may be, the yeast character, the malt, and the hops, all still have to be evident in your fruit beer. You can't add so much fruit that you can't taste the beer. The color, aroma, and flavor should be appropriate for the base style, like I was saying. So if you're making a wheat beer, German wheat beer with fruit in it, you should be able to taste the yeast esters. If you're making a fruit IPA, you should be able to taste the hops. If you're making a fruit stout, you should be able to taste the roasted malts. Except the one exception thing that should be different is color. If you're making a very light beer and the fruit you're using has a very distinctive color, like say dragon fruit or cherry, that color should be visible in the finished product. So if you're making, say, a cherry pilsner, it should have kind of a pinkish or reddish tint. You should be able to see the influence of the fruit. Haze is typically going to be undesirable. Like we talked about that pectin issue, don't boil your fruit. If you think you have pectin haze, go ahead and add some pectic enzyme or pectinase. There are 3 subcategories in category 29. So 29A is just fruit beers, regular old fruit beers. 29B is fruit and spice beers, as the name suggests. It's a fruit beer that has a spice as defined in category 30 in it as well. And 29C is a specialty fruit beer. This means it's a fruit beer that has fruit and some other fermentable sugar like honey, molasses, brown sugar, stuff like that. But the long and the short of it is, if it has what you would think of as fruit in it, it's a fruit beer by BJCP standards. When you read those standards, it's going to emphasize 2 things over and over and over in every little paragraph. The first thing is the fruit has to be balanced. It has to be enough that you can notice it, but not so much that it overwhelms everything else. And second, everything else that would be true of the style under ordinary circumstances has to be true for your fruit beer as well. The defining characteristics of your beer should still shine through, just like if there was no fruit there at all. So that is about the long and the short of fruit beer. So I will give you guys a chance to type up any questions you might have after all that, while I read over any questions that might have popped up while I was rambling. Like Gord Weave 4 is saying, if you put your 2 gallons of water in the fridge for a couple days before you brew, it always brings your temp down to the acceptable temperature for pitching your yeast. Gord, I have found the exact same thing. Like I said, I don't even bother measuring anymore because I measured it dozens and dozens of times, and every time it came up exactly 65 Fahrenheit. Yes, I will puree this second edition. Pureeing it brings out the flavor a bit more. It gives you a bit more juice and pulp to work with. It kind of just, breaks it all up and breaks it all down so you get the most out of your edition. You could just dump this can in there if you want, but you won't get as much alcohol, flavor, color, or aroma out of it. Like Josh says, haze isn't an issue with hazy IPAs. Wheat beers are farmhouse styles. So if, like I was saying, what's true of the style without fruit should be true of it with fruit. So if you are making a pale ale and you want to make a fruit pale ale, it's got to be clear. If you're making a wheat beer that was going to be hazy anyway and then you're adding fruit to it, don't bother with the pectinase because it's going to be hazy no matter what you do, even if you cold crash it or not. Like Josh is saying, if you dump it in without pureeing, you'll still get ABV, just no flavor or aroma, which is kind of a waste. All right, looks like that is all you guys have for me, so that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for watching. You can tune in tomorrow when Josh is gonna come and do the advanced stream. Thanks you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next week.